Before we begin, just take a second. Maybe you're in bed. Maybe you're sitting at a desk, pretending you'll sleep soon. Maybe there's a faint hum somewhere in your room. If you enjoy these long, quiet journeys, you can like the video or subscribe, only if it feels right. And if you'd like, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I always imagine these stories drifting into different time zones. Somewhere it's midnight, somewhere it's 3 a.m., somewhere the sun is rising over rooftops that were once medieval. Now, let's begin with something very small. Not a sword, not a battle, not Jerusalem, just a piece of cloth. A small strip of fabric, stitched roughly onto someone's shoulder. It wasn't meant to be permanent. It was just a sign, a temporary marker, a visible reminder of a vow, a patch to say, I am going. That was all. A cross sewn onto a tunic. It sounds harmless, almost decorative. And yet, the moment it was stitched, a man's legal identity shifted. Not in heaven. On paper, he could pause debts, delay lawsuits, protect his land from opportunists. The cloth was small, but it bent the law around it. And that was never supposed to become a system. It was meant to be a gesture, but gestures have a way of growing teeth. Imagine being a moneylender in 12th century France. A knight owes you silver, a large amount. Then suddenly he appears in town with a stitched cross on his chest. And now you must wait. You must wait, because he is under protection. Not your protection, God's. It was temporary, just until he returned. Of course, many did not return, and so waiting became a permanent condition. Families learned to manage absence. Wives ran estates. Stewards handled disputes. Clerks recorded promises that stretched across oceans, all because of a small piece of cloth. It was practical, it was improvised, and like most medieval improvisations, it quietly hardened into custom. Soon people were not just taking vows, they were calculating them. Could you take the cross without really intending to leave? What if you left, but came back early? Did the protections still apply? Lawyers, well, medieval versions of lawyers, began arguing. Entire courtrooms debated whether someone's stitch counted, and all the while the cloth remained small, soft, fading in the sun. It's interesting, isn't it? How something meant to signal sacrifice became a financial instrument. And this is how it often begins. Not with armies, with paperwork. Now imagine the road. Because once you stitch the cloth, you must eventually move. Not heroically, slowly, with carts, with animals that refuse to cooperate, with boots that split open before you reach the next town. No one romanticizes the second week of walking, the blisters, the smell, the argument over who carries the spare cooking pot. It was never designed to be efficient. They didn't have supply chains. They had hope and maybe salted meat. Sometimes, but mostly, they had improvisation. You run out of grain. You borrow from a village. The village resents you. Next time you pass through, they close the gates. Temporary solution. Permanent hostility. Over time, roots formed, not because someone planned them, because thousands of exhausted men kept stepping in the same direction. And when something repeats long enough, it stops feeling temporary. It becomes tradition. The road to the east was not carved by strategy. It was worn into the earth by sore feet and stubbornness. And that road passed through cities that were not prepared. Imagine being a merchant in Constantinople. One day, business is ordinary. The next, tens of thousands arrive, hungry, devout, uncertain what exactly they are doing, temporary guests, except they linger, and the emperor must decide whether to feed them, fight them, or politely escort them onward. Temporary diplomacy, permanent distrust. It is strange how often a crusade begins with someone saying, "We'll figure it out as we go," and then they do. And then that figuring it out becomes policy. Take ships, no one intended for Venice, to become indispensable. It was just practical. You need ships. Venice builds ships. Simple. Except the contract was fixed. The price did not shrink just because fewer crusaders arrived, and so a shortfall became a crisis, and a crisis became a diversion, and a diversion became history, all because of arithmetic. Imagine warriors, fully armored, debating shipping invoices. It sounds absurd. It was. But that absurdity is where permanence hides. Venice did not mean to redirect a crusade. They meant to get paid, temporary leverage, permanent consequences. And somewhere in all of this, someone is just trying to keep his horse alive. Because horses were the real rulers of crusading logistics. Without them, no charge. Without fodder, no horse. Without water, no rider. Entire campaigns collapsed, not from enemy swords, but from exhausted animals. Temporary shortage, permanent vulnerability. Men argued over grain for horses, with more intensity than theology. It's easier to debate oats than eternity. Now think of a camp. Not dramatic, just ordinary, tents sagging in heat. Men waiting. Waiting is the dominant activity of war. You wait for supplies. You wait for orders. You wait for news. And while waiting, systems form. Someone organizes water rotation. Someone assigns guards to wells. Someone sets rules about who eats first. None of this is glorious, but it becomes habit. And habit becomes structure. And structure becomes law. A frontier state is born not from banners, but from ration schedules. And sometimes from boredom, because boredom is inventive. When you are stuck outside a fortified city for months, you build, you dig, you argue, you gamble, you invent siege towers, because staring at stone walls for weeks becomes intolerable. The siege tower was not elegant. It was desperate. Let's just build something taller than the wall. Temporary solution. Permanent siege doctrine. After enough cities fall this way, people expect towers. They design walls differently. Countermeasures emerge. Innovation breeds counter-innovation. All because someone got tired of waiting outside a gate. And inside those gates, life continued. Markets still opened. Bread still baked. Water still needed carrying. Imagine living in a city that is constantly under siege. You still wake up. You still argue with your spouse. You still complain about taxes. War becomes background noise. And when the city falls, new rulers arrive who promise stability. Temporary conquerors, permanent landlords. They bring their own courts, their own laws, assizes written decades later to explain how things are supposed to work. But most laws begin as patchwork. A lord abuses power. A king tries to limit him. A council writes something down. Temporary correction, permanent legal tradition, and the people in between, the merchants, the farmers, The translators learn to survive within the patches. They adapt clothing. Food habits shift. Olive oil replaces butter. Spices become common, not because of ideology, because of proximity. Cultural exchange rarely announces itself. It seeps, like dust through cloth. And somewhere, a knight from northern France finds himself eating lentils in the Levant and pretending he prefers them. He doesn't, but he adapts. Temporary necessity, permanent taste. Military orders began like that too, just a handful of men offering protection to pilgrims. It was practical. Roads were dangerous. Why not create a brotherhood? To guard them, no one expected. A multinational corporation of land, castles, and bureaucracy. But give any organization a charter, land grants, and exemption privileges, and watch it solidify. Rules about how to eat, how to pray, how to sleep, when to speak. Temporary discipline, permanent institution. And inside those institutions, daily life was not heroic. It was repetitive. Meals at fixed hours, prayers by memory, armor maintenance, inventory lists. Even holy warriors must account for spoons, especially spoons, because spoons disappear, and when spoons disappear, someone writes a rule. It's remarkable how often medieval law is simply a response to someone stealing something small. Captivity became routine too. Ransom was more profitable than massacre. Temporary mercy, permanent business model. Nobles were captured, fed adequately, kept alive, because they were worth money. War created a secondary economy. Hostages, negotiators, intermediaries, letters carried across enemy lines. And while leaders debated sums, ordinary captives waited. Waiting again. Waiting is constant. Perhaps the Crusades were less about battle and more about waiting. Waiting for ships, waiting for funds, waiting for reinforcements, waiting for miracles. And in the waiting, systems form, that small cloth cross. We began with, "It still matters," because even generations later, people remember who took the cross. It becomes ancestry, identity. My grandfather went east. Did he return? Maybe, maybe not. But the story remains. Temporary vow, permanent myth. And if we pause here, we could end this thought. But we won't, because nothing truly ended cleanly. Each crusade reopened the same patterns. Debt, improvisation, institution, fatigue, and always someone sewing cloth, someone building a tower, someone calculating a loan, someone feeding a horse. The grand narrative is actually built from inconveniences, from logistical annoyances that hardened into tradition. And if you listen closely, beneath the speeches and battles, you can hear it. The creak of cartwheels, the rustle of fabric being stitched, the quiet argument over grain. History rarely shouts. It accumulates, slowly, like dust on armor. Let's stay here a little longer. There is something almost comforting about a contract. Ink on parchment, names written carefully, numbers agreed upon. It feels solid, predictable, civilized. And that is exactly why it becomes dangerous. Imagine a room in Venice. Not dramatic, just practical. Wooden tables, ledgers open, men calculating. They are not thinking about salvation. They are thinking about timber, sailcloth, dock space, ship capacity. A fleet must be built. Not because anyone loves fleets, but because thousands of people have decided to cross the sea at the same time. This was not meant to become permanent infrastructure. It was a one-time arrangement. We need transport. Very well, we will build it. But ships are expensive. Wood must be cut months in advance. Carpenters must be paid. Trade must pause while labor is redirected. And so the contract is fixed. The number is firm, because timber does not care about piety. And then, fewer crusaders arrive than expected. Not dramatically fewer, just enough. Enough to create silence. Enough to make everyone stare at the ledger. This is where temporary solutions begin to sweat. The fleet is ready. The bill is due. But the money is not there. No one planned for that. No one meant for arithmetic. To steer a holy expedition. But mathematics is stubborn. And so someone suggests a detour. Just briefly, just to cover the cost. A city nearby owes Venice money. Why not assist in collecting it? Temporary redirection. Practical, almost reasonable. Until you realize that thousands of armed pilgrims are now pointed at a Christian city instead of Jerusalem. No one intended that to become a defining moment. It was simply an invoice problem. But history rarely cares about intention. The detour becomes an event. The event becomes precedent. And suddenly, crusading can be redirected by debt, not by theology, by deficit. It's strangely modern and slightly embarrassing. Imagine explaining to someone that a sacred campaign was rerouted because of a payment schedule. But that is how systems evolve, through inconvenience, through obligation, through the quiet authority of contracts. Now, think of the men themselves. They are not reading the fine print. They are waiting at port, waiting again. Ships creak in the harbour. The smell of tar and salt hangs in the air. Some are seasick before departure. Some have never seen the sea before. Temporary discomfort, permanent anxiety. A horse does not enjoy ships. A knight enjoys it even less. When the horse is unhappy, animals panic, men panic, and still the fleet sails. Because once you build that many ships, you must use them. Infrastructure demands purpose. It refuses to remain idle, and so the sea becomes a corridor. Italian merchants gain quarters in eastern ports. Warehouses appear. Chaplains travel with cargo manifests. Temporary trading privileges become entrenched neighborhoods. A baker sets up an oven. A blacksmith sets up tools. A church is built for sailors. No one meant to found micro-cities. They were just supporting the expedition. But the expedition lingers and lingers. And suddenly there are children born in what was supposed to be a transit stop, temporary colony, permanent quarter. It is almost gentle how permanent sneaks in. No one announces it. It just stays. Meanwhile, far inland, another temporary solution is unfolding. A siege. No one truly loves sieges. They are slow, hot, uncomfortable. You arrive before a city and realize that walls are stubborn. So someone says, we'll build something taller, not because they are engineers, because they are impatient. Timber is gathered, rope is twisted. Men who yesterday were farmers are now carpenters of war. The first siege tower is not elegant. It is awkward. It wobbles. It smells of fresh wood and fear. Temporary machine until it works. And once it works, it becomes expectation. Next time, Walls are built thicker. Countermeasures appear. Mining begins. Countermining, fire arrows, wet hides to protect against fire. Innovation chasing innovation. All because someone grew tired of staring at stone. But let's step away from walls. Let's sit in the camp. Night, armor loosened, boots removed. The air smells of sweat and damp canvas. Someone argues about ration distribution. Someone else claims the water was not fairly shared. It sounds trivial, but this is where order forms. You cannot maintain an army without rules about bread. You cannot maintain morale. If one group eats first every night, temporary ration schedule, permanent hierarchy, even boredom creates tradition. Men gamble. They tell exaggerated stories. They invent rituals before battle to feel control. One man always touches a particular buckle. Another mutters a prayer at a specific hour. Superstition is a temporary coping mechanism. Given enough repetition, it becomes sacred. And when thousands repeat it, it becomes culture. Now imagine a hospital, not a modern one, a hall with beds, some wounded, some feverish, men who took vows to fight, now cleaning wounds. The original idea was simple. Protect pilgrims, offer care, temporary charity. But wounds do not stop arriving, and pilgrims do not stop traveling. So a rule is written, then expanded, then copied. A brotherhood forms. Meals at set hours, silence during prayer, armor stacked beside medical tools, temporary service, permanent order, and like all institutions, it begins counting its property, land grants, donations, exemptions. Before long, the caretakers own castles, not because they sought power, because maintenance requires funding, and funding accumulates. Piety grows assets. It is almost ironic. The vow of poverty, administering estates. Meanwhile, somewhere far from ports and sieges, a wife sits at a table, reviewing accounts. Her husband has gone east. She did not. But the estate must function. Tenants still owe rent. Fields must be harvested. Disputes must be judged. Temporary absence. Permanent competence. Many women learned governance because men chased vows. And when some men did not return, their authority quietly expanded, not through revolution, through necessity. And necessity is the most persuasive teacher. Captivity becomes routine too. A captured noble is not killed. He is valuable. Temporary mercy, permanent ransom system. Letters travel between enemies. Sums negotiated. Hostages exchanged. War becomes business. Polite, even, on certain days, and brutal on others. Contradiction was normal. On Monday you pray for victory. On Tuesday you negotiate payment for your opponent's son. Human beings are excellent at holding opposites. We should return to the cloth, because it is still there, faded now, edges fraying, but it changed everything. It turned absence into privilege, debt into delay, delay into law, law into precedent, precedent into identity. A symbol meant to last months, shaped generations. And every time a new crusade was preached, someone stitched another cross, each believing it was temporary, each unaware that the system was already permanent. History does not freeze. It accumulates, like ledger entries, like siege stones, like unpaid debts. And if you listen carefully, beneath the grand speeches, you can still hear the scratch of quill on parchment, the quiet recalculation, the moment someone says, "We'll fix it later," and later never arrives. Let's stay a little longer, because permanence is rarely announced. It simply refuses to leave. It begins with a well, not a battlefield, not a king, just a well in the middle of a temporary camp. Water is always ordinary until it isn't. At first, no one plans the rotation. Men simply walk up with buckets. They push. They argue. Someone drinks too much. Someone else gets nothing. It's inefficient. So a rule is made. Not a grand law, just a suggestion. You first, then you, then the cavalry. Temporary order. It works. The next morning, they repeat it. And suddenly the order is no longer a suggestion. It is expectation, and expectation becomes discipline. Now guards are placed near the well, not to protect the water from enemies, to protect it from allies, because thirst makes people unreasonable. Within days, access to water reflects rank. Knights first, infantry after, servants last. No one designed a social structure around a hole in the ground, but that is what happens. Temporary solution, permanent hierarchy. And when the army moves, the pattern moves with it. New camp, new well, same order. Soon it feels natural, as if it had always been that way. This is how traditions are born, not through ceremony, through repetition, under pressure. And somewhere in the background, someone is still wearing that stitched cross, still under protection, still waiting for something glorious to happen. Instead, he waits in line for water. History is rarely what we imagine, and then the well runs dry, because wells do that. Now the system collapses. Panic returns. Improvisation again. Men sent farther to fetch water. Protection squads formed. A new hierarchy appears. Those who control water control calm, temporary power. But even that leaves residue. After the campaign ends, those same men return home with new habits. They understand scarcity differently. They understand order differently. They understand that authority often begins with something small, like water, or cloth, or debt. The grand narratives speak of destiny, but destiny is thirsty, and thirsty people create rules. There is a quiet moment before departure, not on the battlefield. At a table, a candle burns low. A man signs something. He owes silver, not a terrifying amount, just enough to matter. He promises to repay it after he returns. After, such a flexible word, the lender hesitates. But then he sees the cloth cross, stitched to the man's shoulder. Ah, that changes things, because now the debt must wait, not forgiven, not erased, just suspended. It was a compassionate adjustment, a temporary mercy. You cannot demand payment from someone riding toward Jerusalem. That would seem crude. So the law bends slightly. And once law bends, people notice. Soon, taking the cross is not only a vow, it is leverage. If you are overwhelmed with obligations, perhaps what you need is not repayment, but pilgrimage. Not everyone is cynical, but enough are practical. Debts sleep, laws pause, court cases freeze mid-sentence. And while the debtor marches east, his creditors wait. Waiting becomes its own burden. Fields must still be worked. Families must still eat. Money tied up in absence creates quiet resentment, temporary protection, permanent complication. And sometimes the debtor never returns. Now the ledger becomes a ghost story. Is he dead? Captured? Delayed? Can the land be reclaimed? Is the vow still active? Clerks argue over ink that has faded. The cloth cross may have rotted away, but the legal ripple remains. Years pass. Children inherit confusion. Widows inherit authority. Lenders inherit uncertainty. All because the law decided, once, to be kind. It is fascinating how mercy can destabilize structure, but it rarely returns to its original shape. The next time a crusade is preached, the protections are already expected. They are no longer innovation, they are standard. And standard things are difficult to remove, even when inconvenient, even when exploited. Because once people organize their lives around a temporary exception, the exception becomes invisible. It becomes normal. Meanwhile, in another town, a different man takes the cross. Not because of faith, not entirely. Because harvest was poor, because taxes are high, because leaving is sometimes easier than staying. Temporary escape, permanent absence. The Crusades were full of noble speeches, but also full of private calculations. Some went seeking glory, some went seeking forgiveness, some went seeking relief from something much smaller, a neighbor, a debt, a dispute. History remembers banners. It forgets overdue payments. And yet, overdue payments moved armies. There is something almost tender about the way medieval society tried to protect those who left. Protection of property, protection of family, protection from opportunistic lawsuits. All sensible, all humane, but protection requires administration. Administration requires record. Record requires authority. Authority accumulates. And so the machinery grows. Temporary wartime adjustment, permanent bureaucratic muscle. It becomes easier, over time, to declare something a crusade, because the system already exists. The forms are ready. The privileges understood. The legal language polished. What began as improvisation becomes template. And templates are powerful. They make repetition effortless. Somewhere a lender sighs, another cross-stitched, another account paused. He wonders how long this one will last. He wonders whether Jerusalem is worth the interest. He wonders whether God understands compound delay. He will never say that aloud, but he will adjust his rates next season, because even faith must account for risk. There is a house somewhere in northern France, not grand, not poor, just ordinary, a wooden table, a hearth that smokes slightly too much, a chest with iron hinges that squeak when opened. A man leaves that house. He promises to return. He does not promise when, just after. After Jerusalem, after victory, after God decides. His wife watches him go. At first, everything feels temporary. The fields still need tending. The rent must still be collected. The chickens do not pause for pilgrimage. She tells the steward, "We will manage until he returns." Until. Such a delicate word. The first month passes. Then another. A letter arrives. Then silence. The legal protections remain in place. The land cannot be seized. Creditors must wait. The system is functioning temporarily, but seasons do not wait politely. Harvest cycles do not adjust to crusading schedules. She begins making decisions. Small ones at first. Repair the fence. Negotiate a rent dispute. Dismiss a lazy worker. temporary authority, but she repeats it again and again. Soon, tenants do not say, "We will ask your husband." They say, "What do you decide?" That shift is quiet, almost invisible, but powerful. No decree announced it. No banner declared it. It emerged from absence, temporary absence, permanent competence. And if the husband returns, the balance has changed. He may not realize it immediately, but she has governed. She understands accounts. She knows which neighbors are unreliable, which fields flood in spring, which debts are realistic. Authority learned in crisis rarely disappears completely. The Crusades reshaped households without ever stepping inside them, because absence is transformative. Now imagine the alternative. He does not return. Years pass. Rumors arrive. Captured, dead, converted. No one knows. The law hesitates. When is a man officially gone? How long must you wait? Is she still a wife? Is she a widow? Can she remarry? Temporary uncertainty, permanent anxiety. Some waited 5 years, some 10, some never knew. And the legal system, built to protect the crusader, now struggles to define his ghost. Children grow up with stories instead of fathers. Inheritance disputes simmer quietly. Brothers claim land. Cousins argue over entitlement. The stitched cross outlives the body. The vow lingers, longer than the man. In towns far from that house, something similar is happening on a larger scale. Crusaders arrive in eastern cities. They are not meant to stay, just reclaim, just secure, just pass through. But walls require garrisons, ports require administration, markets require supervision, temporary occupation, permanent residency. A baker from Pisa opens an oven in Acre just to serve the fleet. The fleet returns next year, and the year after. The oven remains. He marries. A child is born. Was this ever meant to be a colony? Not officially. It was logistics. But logistics has children, and children anchor permanence. Italian quarters appear in ports, warehouses, churches, privileges negotiated. At first, it is convenience. Then it is entitlement. Then it is expected. A foreign district, inside a foreign land. Temporary commercial arrangement. Permanent micro-city. And with permanence comes tension. Local merchants resent exemptions. Crusaders resent local customs. Everyone depends on everyone else, which is the most uncomfortable arrangement of all. Dependence without trust. Yet markets open every morning, because commerce is practical, and practicality often outlives ideology. Back in the north, another house waits. Another woman manages accounts. Another creditor sighs. Another cross is stitched. It becomes routine. People begin planning for absence. Before absence happens, they prepare documents in advance. They clarify inheritance early. Temporary campaign planning. Permanent social adjustment. The Crusades did not only move armies, they altered expectations. It became normal to imagine someone leaving for years. Normal to structure law around departure. Normal to accept that after might mean never. And perhaps that is the strangest transformation. Not the battles, not the sieges, but the quiet normalization of uncertainty. A world learning to function with open-ended absence. If you listen carefully, you can almost hear it. the creak of that iron chest opening, the soft scratch of quill as she updates accounts, the distant echo of boots on stone in a port city far away, all of it connected through vows, through improvisation, through temporary decisions that refuse to remain temporary. And still, no one believes they are building something permanent. They are only surviving this season, just this one. There is a stretch of land outside a city, dry, uneven, unremarkable. An army arrives. They do not intend to stay long, just until the gates open, just until negotiations succeed, just until God intervenes. So tents are raised loosely, stakes hammered without precision, fires lit wherever convenient. Temporary arrangement. But the gates do not open. Negotiations stall. God, for the moment, is silent. And so the camp remains. Days pass, then weeks. Someone suggests organizing the tents more carefully. The cavalry together, the infantry elsewhere, clergy near the center. It makes sense. Less confusion at night, less accidental trampling, temporary improvement. Except now the arrangement is remembered. The next siege begins the same way. Tents placed in order from the start, because chaos is exhausting. Order saves energy, and energy is survival. A street appears between rows of canvas, a place where men walk regularly. Soon it is called something, not officially, but enough that everyone knows where it is. Meet me near the well, near the cooks. Temporary geography, permanent layout. Markets form inside the camp. Bread sellers, ale vendors, a man who sharpens blades. He was not recruited as a soldier. He simply followed opportunity. Temporary enterprise, permanent economy. Some camps lasted months, some more than a year. Children were born there. Imagine that. Born between siege engines, born into a space never meant to exist. What do you call someone whose birthplace is a military encampment? Temporary life, permanent memory. And once you have markets and births, you need rules. You cannot have gambling disputes turning violent every night. You cannot have water stolen at sword point. So captains assign watches. Penalties are defined. Punishments become predictable. Predictability becomes governance. This is how institutions are born, not in palaces, in mud. Now think about those who chose a different response. Instead of returning home after one campaign, some stayed. They realized that constant departure and return was inefficient. If the Holy Land required defense, why not create a standing force? Not seasonal, not improvised, permanent. At first, it was simple. A few men agree to remain, to protect pilgrims on the road, to patrol between cities, temporary guardianship. But roads are long, pilgrims are many, bandits are persistent. And so rules are written, shared meals, shared prayer, shared discipline. They sleep together, fight together, obey a master. It feels monastic. It feels military. It feels strange. And because it is strange, it needs structure. Structure requires charters. Charters require recognition. Recognition brings donations. Donations bring land. Land brings revenue. Revenue brings permanence. A brotherhood meant to guard a road now owns estates in Europe. Temporary defense, permanent order, and, like all permanent orders, they begin keeping records. Inventory of armor, inventory of grain, inventory of spoons. Spoons matter. If spoons disappear nightly, someone must account for them. And once you are counting spoons, you are no longer temporary. You are an institution. It is almost humorous how holiness becomes bookkeeping, but it always does. Because feeding men is more urgent than inspiring them. Back in the camp, the siege continues. The tower is built. It collapses. They build another. It holds. The wall cracks. A breach forms. Victory comes. Or defeat. Either way, the camp dismantles. Canvas folded. Ashes scattered. The land looks empty again. But it is not the same land. The memory of order remains. The men carry it with them. Next time, they will organize faster. Next time, they will plan rations earlier. Temporary encampment, permanent knowledge, and knowledge travels. A knight who learned discipline in the Levant returns to Europe. He organizes his estate differently. He structures labor more efficiently. He remembers how quickly chaos spreads. The Crusades did not only export war, they imported systems, imported habits, imported expectations of structure. Even the way castles were managed shifted. More record keeping, more attention to supply, because siege teaches harsh lessons, and harsh lessons tend to linger. There is something quietly ironic about how a movement fueled by spiritual urgency produced administrative precision. You expect passion, you receive paperwork, you expect prophecy, you receive procurement. Yet perhaps that is the most human outcome. People adapt. Under pressure, they refine. Under threat, they standardize. Temporary survival methods harden into permanent frameworks. And frameworks outlive the danger. Somewhere, years later, a commander organizes his men in neat rows before even raising tents. He does not remember who first suggested it. He assumes it has always been done this way. He is wrong, but that is how permanence feels. It erases its own beginning, and the land outside that city, once dry and unremarkable, has seen generations of camps, each believing itself temporary, each leaving invisible patterns behind. Order pressed into memory, memory pressed into tradition, tradition pressed into law, and all of it beginning with men who thought they would only stay a few days. There is a battlefield at dusk, dust settling, armor dented, voices tired. Among the fallen, a nobleman is recognized, not because of his face, because of his belt, his horse, the embroidery on his cloak. He is captured, and for a moment, someone considers ending it quickly, but someone else says, no, he is worth something. Worth. Such an ordinary word. In the middle of something sacred. Killing him would be simple. Ransoming him is profitable. Temporary mercy. Permanent calculation. He is given water. Not kindness exactly. Investment. A tent is assigned. Guards are posted. Not to keep him safe from enemies. To keep him safe from his own despair, because a dead hostage is useless. War, slowly, learns arithmetic. Nobles become walking coin purses. Captivity becomes a profession. Messengers travel between lines. Letters written carefully. Polite phrases exchanged between men who tried to kill each other last week. We hope you are in good health. We trust negotiations will proceed smoothly. It is strangely civilized, until it isn't. Because ransom requires time, and time creates tension. If payment is delayed, threats are implied. Not immediately, gently, a finger removed, a diet reduced. A rumor spread. Temporary pressure. Permanent fear. Over years, this pattern stabilizes. No longer chaotic. Structured. There are expected sums for certain ranks. A count costs more than a knight. A knight costs more than a squire. Even mercy has a price list. It becomes predictable. Predictability reduces massacre and increases war's profitability. Temporary compassion, permanent industry, and sometimes the captive grows accustomed. Months pass. He speaks a little of the local language, learns the rhythm of the camp, understands his captor's habits. Human beings adjust. Even in captivity, it is uncomfortable to admit, but adaptation is universal. There were prisoners who returned home with stories not of horror, but of conversations, shared meals, shared frustrations, enemies discovering they both dislike the same weather, temporary understanding, permanent confusion, because when you return home, how do you describe that? That the other laughed? That the enemy had a favorite horse? Such nuance does not travel easily, but it lingers privately, and private nuance softens rigid narratives. Slowly, quietly. Now imagine a different scenario. A city falls, thousands captured, not nobles, ordinary people. They cannot be ransomed easily, so they are distributed, sold, integrated, temporary displacement, permanent demographic change. Households shift, labor shifts. Children grow up speaking mixed languages. No one intended cultural blending, they intended conquest. But conquest rearranges populations, and rearranged populations create hybrid worlds. Markets adjust, customs adapt, food changes, names blend, temporary upheaval, permanent mixture, and sometimes, years later, a former captive chooses not to return because life has settled. Because roots have formed in unexpected soil, history rarely includes those quiet decisions. It prefers grand returns. But many stories dissolve into ordinary life. Back on the battlefield, the practice of ransom becomes standard. Knights hesitate before striking certain opponents, because killing him removes potential income. War moderates itself, not out of mercy, out of calculation. And calculation spreads. Soon, before battle even begins, agreements are implied. Capture if possible, kill if necessary. Temporary strategy, permanent etiquette. War develops manners. Rough ones, but manners nonetheless. It is almost absurd to imagine men discussing payment schedules over bruised knuckles. But that absurdity is what stabilizes violence. Systems emerge where chaos once ruled. And once systems exist, they resist disappearance, even when peace arrives, because someone is always prepared to calculate the next ransom. And in some distant monastery, a scribe records these sums, carefully, ink steady. He does not see battle. He sees numbers. He ensures the memory of captivity is preserved in ledgers. Temporary crisis, permanent archive. And archives shape memory. Memory shapes tradition. Tradition shapes expectation. Soon, when a noble rides to war, he understands the risk. Death or debt, both costly. He prepares accordingly, arranges funds in advance, secures pledges from relatives, temporary precaution, permanent financial planning. The economy of ransom reshapes noble behavior. It is no longer only bravery at stake. It is liquidity. There is a strange tenderness in this pattern. Enemies feeding each other so that they may be paid. Guards ensuring a captive sleeps well enough to survive negotiation. Mercy born from profit. Cruelty moderated by arithmetic. It is not noble, but it is human, and, like everything we have seen, it began as improvisation. One captured night. One decision not to kill. One calculation. Repeated again, until repetition becomes rule, and rule becomes custom, and custom feels ancient, even though it was once just a moment of hesitation on a dusty field at dusk. There is a port city on the eastern shore, wind off the sea, stone walls pale in the sun, a harbour crowded with masts. Ships arrive, carrying men, horses, barrels of grain. They are not here to settle, only to supply, only to pass through. So a small warehouse is rented, just a building near the docks, temporary storage. Someone hangs a sign in Latin, another in Italian, because sailors need directions. Grain stacked, wine casks rolled into shadow. It is practical, no ceremony, no declaration of colony, just convenience. But convenience attracts repetition. The fleet returns next season. The same warehouse is used. The baker nearby notices the pattern. He expands his oven. Temporary increase in demand. Permanent expansion of business. Soon, a narrow street by the docks is mostly occupied by foreigners. A chapel is built just for the crews. Temporary prayer space. But prayer requires clergy. Clergy require residence. Residence requires security. Security requires agreement with local rulers. Privileges negotiated. Exemptions granted. It is all very sensible, very transactional. And suddenly there is a quarter of the city that feels slightly different. Different bread, different accents, different coins changing hands. No one declared it autonomous, but it begins to act that way. Temporary arrangement, permanent enclave. Merchants resolve disputes among themselves. They prefer familiar judges, familiar language. It is easier. Soon the quarter has its own customs, its own rhythms. Children grow up bilingual. Some marry locals. Some do not. Dependence deepens, because trade binds tighter than theology. The Crusaders depend on local markets. Local markets depend on Crusader demand. Everyone resents everyone else, and yet everyone profits. It is the most uncomfortable equilibrium, mutual irritation, mutual necessity, and over time, irritation dulls. Necessity remains. The port adjusts. Weights standardized. Dock schedules refined. Contracts become predictable. What began as support for a campaign becomes a commercial artery. Even when armies thin, the merchants remain, because merchants follow routes, and routes, once carved, rarely vanish. The crusade may fade, the corridor persists. Inside that quarter, a child is born, his father from Genoa, his mother from the Levant. He does not know he represents a geopolitical improvisation. He only knows the smell of sea salt and spices mixed in one kitchen. Temporary coexistence, permanent generation. Cultures bleed into each other quietly. Food changes first. Oil replaces butter in some homes. Spices appear in northern recipes. Fabric styles shift. Armor adapts to heat. Not from admiration, from practicality. The Levant is hot. Wool suffocates. Temporary adaptation. Permanent fashion. Even architecture shifts. Stone courtyards open for airflow, windows designed differently. You can almost trace the outline of the Crusades, not in battlefields, but in kitchens, in building plans, in the way bread is baked. It is almost domestic, almost tender, which feels strange, given the violence that carried it there. But tension never fully dissolves. Privileges granted to foreign merchants. Anger local traders. Tax exemptions sting. Disputes simmer. Temporary concessions become permanent grievances. And grievances accumulate because nothing remains purely commercial. Politics seeps in. Faith hovers in the background. Trust is partial, always partial. Yet ships keep coming because grain must move, because silver must circulate. Because once a system of exchange exists, it resists collapse, even when war intensifies, even when cities change hands. The quarter adapts, flags shift, agreements rewritten, but the ovens still burn. The docks still echo with rope against wood. Temporary rulers, permanent harbour. Somewhere inland, a man from that port quarter joins a caravan. He travels beyond the coast, carries goods deeper into contested lands. He is less concerned with crusade or counter-crusade. He is concerned with margins, temporary neutrality, permanent survival strategy. The Crusades, for many, were not constant warfare. They were negotiation, adaptation, commerce woven through conflict. And over time, the very idea of East and West as separate softens slightly, not in sermons. In markets, where coins from different realms clink in the same pouch, if you walk through that street at dusk, you would not immediately think of holy war. You would smell bread, hear children arguing, watch sailors unloading cargo. And perhaps that is the quiet truth. The grand narrative speaks of conquest, but permanence is built by bakers and accountants, by dock workers and interpreters, by people who intended only to stay for a season and stayed, because systems reward those who remain. Temporary presence, permanent quarter. And when, generations later, someone asks how that enclave began, the answer is vague. It has always been there, which is rarely true, but permanence is very good at rewriting its own origin. There is a man with a fever, not dramatic, just shivering in a tent, his armor stacked beside him, his pride slightly dented. He believes the illness is temporary, a passing imbalance, a test. Someone suggests bleeding him because that is familiar, because that is what they know. It is done. He weakens further. The fever persists. Then, almost reluctantly, someone calls for a local physician, not an enemy exactly, but not quite trusted. He enters the tent quietly, smells different, speaks softly, examines the patient, suggests something unexpected. Less blood, more rest, a mixture of herbs unfamiliar to Frankish eyes. Temporary consultation, permanent curiosity. The night survives, not because of divine intervention, because of unfamiliar knowledge. At first it is dismissed, an exception, but illness repeats, heat repeats, and gradually, slowly, techniques migrate. Temporary borrowing, permanent adaptation. Medical practices shift quietly, not officially, not announced, but whispered. You know, last time. And that whisper travels farther than sermons. War, oddly, becomes a classroom. Men observe each other, weapons first, then habits, Then healing. The Crusades were violent, but violence forces proximity, and proximity forces learning, even unwilling learning. There are misunderstandings too. Cultural friction. A Frankish knight laughs at a bathhouse. Too soft, he thinks. Too indulgent. Later, in the heat, he remembers the cool tiles. Temporary mockery. Permanent appreciation. Clothing shifts as well. Long sleeves replaced by lighter fabrics. Helmets adjusted for climate. At first, these are compromises. But over years, they become style. And style travels home. A returning crusader wears something slightly different. Neighbors notice. He shrugs. It is practical. Practicality reshapes aesthetics. And aesthetics linger. Then there are the conversations. Awkward ones. Shared meals between supposed enemies. A prisoner treated with courtesy. A merchant negotiating across faith lines. Temporary civility. Permanent memory. There are stories of mutual bewilderment, of a Frankish doctor amputating quickly, while a local physician insists on patience, of hunters comparing falcons, of jokes misunderstood. These moments rarely enter official chronicles, but they exist, and they accumulate. Gradually, an image of the other becomes more complicated. Still adversary, still rival, but no longer entirely abstract. And that subtle shift matters. Even if it does not prevent war, it softens certain edges. It introduces hesitation, temporary empathy, permanent nuance. Back in Europe, years later, a man describes Eastern spices at dinner. His family listens skeptically. Too strong, too strange. But eventually, someone tries it. Temporary novelty, permanent flavor. Trade supports repetition. Repetition supports habit. Habit becomes expectation, and expectation becomes culture. The Crusades are remembered for swords, but they also move tastes, textures, architectural ideas, administrative habits. Even the concept of hospital care shifted in some regions, because someone once watched how another culture organized healing and decided to copy it, not out of admiration, out of survival, which is more persuasive than admiration. Yet tension remains. Learning does not erase rivalry. Borrowing does not dissolve suspicion. Instead, it creates a complicated coexistence. Men fighting by day and discussing falconry by night. It sounds improbable, but human beings are capable of compartmentalization, temporary truce, permanent memory, and those memories travel quietly through letters, through returning veterans, through merchants, through stories told in dim halls. Stories rarely end cleanly. They fade into daily life. The knight who once feared foreign medicine now recommends it casually. The merchant who once distrusted local coin now calculates exchange rates effortlessly. The pilgrim who once mocked Eastern customs now misses them. It is subtle, but it remains. In a small courtyard somewhere in Acre, two men stand over a patient, one from the north, one local. They disagree, they debate, they adjust. The patient survives. Neither claims victory. They move on to the next case. Temporary cooperation, permanent exchange, and history will not record their names, but it will reflect their influence in hospital rules, in medical texts, in quiet, accumulated adaptation. The Crusades were meant to reclaim. Instead, they intertwined, not evenly, not peacefully, but irreversibly. If you walk through that pork quarter again, you may hear multiple languages, smell blended cuisine, see fabrics that belong to more than one tradition. None of it was planned. All of it was repeated. Temporary encounters, permanent layering, and somewhere beneath it all, the original vow still echoes. A cross stitched in cloth, a promise made. No one anticipated that the promise would reshape kitchens, hospitals, wardrobes, and conversations. But permanence rarely announces itself. It seeps through repetition, through necessity, through survival. There is a dispute, not about faith, not about territory, about land, a field just outside a fortified town. Two men claim it. One says his lord granted it years ago. The other insists the grant was temporary, revoked during the last siege. They stand before a group of nobles. The air is heavy. No one wants disorder, because disorder on a frontier is dangerous. So they decide to clarify. Just this once. Just to prevent future confusion. A ruling is written carefully, witnessed, temporary correction. But the next year, another dispute emerges. Different field, different claim. The previous ruling is referenced. It becomes precedent. Precedent is comforting. It saves time, and time in a fragile kingdom is precious. Soon, collections of these rulings accumulate, not because anyone intended to compose a grand legal code, because confusion keeps returning. Temporary patch, permanent framework. A frontier state cannot survive without predictability, and predictability requires law. So law thickens, details multiply. Who owes service to whom? How many days of military duty? What happens if a vassal refuses? What happens if a lord abuses power? All very practical, all very specific. And over decades, what began as improvisation feels ancient. People speak of our customs as if they descended from heaven, but they were assembled in moments of irritation, in rooms filled with tired men who simply wanted stability. Temporary settlement, permanent constitution. In a courtroom in Jerusalem, a knight argues with a merchant. The merchant is not noble, but he owns property, and property demands recognition. So separate courts emerge, one for nobles, one for burgesses. Temporary accommodation for diversity, permanent dual system. Each group clings to its privileges. Privileges, once granted, rarely shrink. They expand because expectation grows around them. And when expectation grows, withdrawal feels like injustice. So the legal structure becomes layered, complicated, resilient. Not because it was brilliantly designed, because it was repeatedly adjusted. Law, like a siege tower, is built in response to pressure. And once built, it remains standing, longer than anyone expected. Now imagine a king noticing that powerful nobles are becoming too independent. They control fortresses. They negotiate privately. They delay obligations. It is dangerous. So he introduces a reform, not revolutionary, just corrective. All nobles shall be directly bound. Temporary strengthening of the crown, permanent shift in hierarchy. But even that creates friction, because power, rearranged, never rests easily. Some comply, some resist quietly, some interpret the law creatively. Interpretation becomes another layer. Temporary ambiguity, permanent debate. Law is never static. It breathes, it stretches, it adapts, especially in places born from conquest, where legitimacy is always fragile and fragility demands structure. Meanwhile, in Europe, similar legal habits begin appearing. More written agreements, more charters, more attention to recorded obligation, because absence taught caution, because frontier disputes revealed the cost of vagueness. Temporary legal innovation, permanent bureaucratic instinct. The Crusades did not invent law, but they accelerated its refinement, because distance magnifies uncertainty, and uncertainty forces documentation. A scribe copies rulings by candlelight. He does not imagine that centuries later, scholars will call it a code. To him, it is just order, just clarity, just prevention of tomorrow's argument, temporary convenience, permanent archive. And beneath all of this, ordinary people adjust. They learn how to petition, how to appeal, how to navigate layered authority. Because survival depends not only on swords, but on understanding procedure. The frontier produces not only warriors, but litigants, men who once only fought, now argue, persuade, negotiate. It is a quieter form of battle, and often more enduring. If you step back, you notice a pattern. Every crisis births a rule. Every rule births expectation. Every expectation births identity. And identity hardens. The kingdom in the East was never meant to exist indefinitely. It was supposed to be reclaimed, secured, then perhaps relinquished to peace. Instead, it built courts, institutions, procedures, because once people live somewhere long enough, they stop improvising, they systematize. Temporary occupation, permanent governance, and governance reshapes mentality. A knight raised in the Levant thinks differently than one raised in Normandy. He understands negotiation across cultures. He expects written clarity. He anticipates siege logistics. He is a product of accumulation, of repeated adjustments, of laws written to fix yesterday's problem and inherited by tomorrow's generation. In that courtroom, the dispute over the field finally ends. A judgment is delivered. The men leave, satisfied or resentful, but orderly, because order matters more than victory, especially on a frontier. And somewhere in the archives, another parchment joins the stack. No fanfare, no celebration, just ink drying quietly. Temporary solution, permanent memory. And memory, when repeated often enough, becomes tradition. Tradition becomes heritage. And heritage convinces people that what was once improvised has always existed. There is a city at dawn, walls scarred, streets tense, ships waiting in the harbour with sails half raised. Everyone knows, even before the breach. Supplies are thin, allies are distant. Hope is negotiated. When the walls finally give way, it feels like an ending. Trumpets, smoke, running footsteps echoing through stone corridors. People believe collapse is final, that when a city falls, history pauses, but it does not. It rearranges. At first, chaos. Doors broken, warehouses opened, goods carried hurriedly toward the docks. Temporary panic, permanent migration. Families who had lived there for generations board ships with only what they can carry. Ledgers, relics, tools, recipes remembered, not written. A baker does not bring his oven, he brings knowledge. And knowledge travels light. The harbour empties, but not completely, because even conquerors require structure. Markets must reopen. Water must flow. Taxes must be collected. Temporary victory, permanent administration. The new rulers step into offices, still warm from the last occupants. They examine the same streets, the same wells, the same port facilities, and they decide to keep them because dismantling a system is inefficient. It is easier to inherit, and so institutions persist through regime change, temporary sovereignty, permanent infrastructure. In Europe, news arrives slowly. A city has fallen. Shock, grief, anger, calls for another expedition. Temporary outrage, permanent narrative. The loss becomes legend. The legend fuels sermons. The sermons inspire vows. The system activates again. Debt protections reinstated. Ships contracted. Crosses stitched. It is almost cyclical. Fall does not end the mechanism. It resets it, like a tide withdrawing, only to return. Meanwhile, refugees settle in new towns, some in Cyprus, some in Italian ports. They bring habits formed under siege. They expect walls to be strong. They expect documentation to be precise. They expect authority to be layered. Temporary displacement, permanent transplantation. The legal codes written in the East travel westward, adjusted, copied, adapted. A frontier mentality seeps into Europe. Heightened awareness of supply, of defense, of administration. The Crusader states may weaken, but their practices survive, carried by people, by paper, by memory. And then there is the quiet detail, rarely mentioned. After the fall, the marketplace reopens, under different oversight, different language spoken by officials. But bread is still baked, fish still sold, water still drawn. Life resumes, because it must. Temporary catastrophe, permanent continuity. It is almost disappointing how resilient systems are. You expect a clean ending. Instead, you find adaptation. Even destruction becomes a catalyst. Siege experience informs new fortifications elsewhere. Loss inspires improved naval organization. Failure refines finance. The Crusades produce collapse. Collapse produces reform. Reform produces readiness. Temporary ruin, permanent lesson. Some who flee never return. Some who conquer never leave. Intermarriage continues quietly. Trade resumes cautiously. Diplomacy re-emerges out of exhaustion. History does not freeze at tragedy. It reorganizes around it. And the stitched cross, the symbol that began so much, still appears in sermons, still appears in letters, but it now carries layers. Not just zeal, but memory of logistics, of law, of cost, of adaptation. The ideal remains. The mechanism evolves. If you stand in that fallen city years later, you may not see ruins. You may see a port functioning again, children playing near walls rebuilt, markets structured under new authority. The names changed. The routines familiar. Temporary fall, permanent pattern, because once a place has learned how to govern itself under pressure, that knowledge does not vanish. It transfers to new rulers, to new contexts, to new crises. And so even the end becomes a beginning, not dramatically, not poetically, but administratively. The ledger opens again. The well is assigned guards again. The market defines its taxes again. And somewhere far away, another man sits at a wooden table, stitching across to his shoulder, believing this time it will be different. It begins with a voice, not in a battlefield, not in a courtroom, in an open space, a field, a square, a gathering. People have come to listen, some out of devotion, some out of curiosity, some because gatherings break routine. The speech is not meant to build an institution. It is meant to ignite. Emotion is immediate. Urgency is sharp. Words about suffering. Words about honor. Words about redemption. Temporary intensity. A crowd stirred. But stirring has consequences, because emotion demands direction, and direction demands structure. At first, the response is chaotic. Men vow impulsively. Some leave within days. Some never leave at all. The movement is uncoordinated, which is dangerous. So organizers refine the process. Preaching circuits develop. Authorized speakers appointed. Guidelines clarified. Temporary enthusiasm. Permanent mechanism. Soon, the call to crusade is no longer spontaneous. It is scheduled, planned, sanctioned. There are formulas. There are permissions. There are indulgences attached. The speech becomes standardized, even if the tone changes, even if the audience shifts, because repetition simplifies recruitment, and simplification stabilizes expectation. The crowd begins to know what will be offered: remission, protection, purpose. The system matures. Temporary sermon, permanent political tool. And rulers observe. They notice how effectively religious language mobilizes resources, how quickly cross-stitching spreads, how rapidly debts freeze. It is powerful. So the concept expands, not only for distant Jerusalem, but for other conflicts, internal ones, border ones. Temporary extension of privilege, permanent expansion of category. The term crusade stretches. It adapts. It absorbs new purposes. And each time it does, the administrative framework activates. Protections granted. Taxes levied. Ships hired. It becomes modular, portable, a template applied to varied problems. And templates are efficient. Efficient tools are reused, sometimes too eagerly. In villages, the speech becomes story, told second-hand, embellished, simplified. Children grow up hearing it, not as policy, as myth, temporary rhetoric, permanent legend. And legends are persuasive. They outlive the practical concerns that birthed them. The original urgency fades, but the narrative remains. A call once meant for one generation becomes inheritance for the next. Meanwhile, critics emerge quietly. Some question cost, some question success, but the machinery is already built. It is easier to activate than dismantle, because dismantling requires admission. Admission requires humility. Humility is scarce in political climates, so the framework remains available, waiting, temporary pause, permanent readiness. There is something deeply human about this pattern. A speech meant to move hearts ends up moving economies. A call meant to inspire sacrifice creates bureaucratic refinement. Emotion becomes infrastructure, and infrastructure reshapes behavior. Men calculate before vowing. Families prepare legal documents. Merchants anticipate supply demand. The crowd is no longer naive. It is experienced. Crusading becomes normalized, an option among others. Temporary fervor, permanent possibility. If you imagine that first gathering, dust in the air, a voice rising above murmurs, no one there believes. They are inaugurating centuries of repetition. They believe they are responding to a moment, but moments repeat, and repetition becomes rhythm, and rhythm becomes institution. The speech echoes, not because it was flawless, but because it was useful. Useful things endure, even when their original context fades. Years later, another preacher stands before another crowd. He uses similar phrases, perhaps softer, perhaps sharper, but the structure is recognizable. The audience understands the process. They know the protections. They know the cost. They know the path. Temporary revival, permanent script, and somewhere in the background, a scribe drafts documents, anticipating vows not yet taken. Because the system now expects repetition, it prepares for it. The cross will be stitched again, the debt suspended again, the ships contracted again, not because it is entirely new, but because it is familiar. Familiarity is powerful. It reduces hesitation. It makes the extraordinary feel routine. And so the Crusades continue, not as a single uninterrupted war, but as a pattern, activated, paused, activated again. Each cycle reinforcing the framework, each failure refining logistics, each success complicating identity, temporary movement, permanent architecture, and beneath it all, the same human impulses: fear, hope, calculation, faith, convenience, mixed together, repeated, layered, until no one remembers which part was meant to be temporary and which part was meant to last. There is a boy sitting near a hearth. He has never seen Jerusalem. He has never seen Acre. He has never boarded a ship, but he has heard of them since before he could read. His father left once. His uncle left twice. A neighbor never returned. The word east does not feel distant to him. It feels scheduled, like harvest, like winter, temporary campaign, permanent background noise. He grows up assuming that at some point someone will go again. Perhaps him, perhaps not. But the possibility is always present. That is how normalization works. Not loudly, quietly. War shifts from shock to expectation, from anomaly to option. The first generation trembled, the second calculated, the third inherited procedure. It is no longer chaos. It is infrastructure. Infrastructure of departure. Infrastructure of funding. Infrastructure of narrative. And infrastructure is difficult to dismantle. In the East, a similar quiet adaptation unfolds. Communities accustomed to raids build thicker walls, store grain more carefully, develop warning systems, temporary precaution, permanent vigilance. Markets adjust to instability. Trade routes shift slightly to avoid contested zones. Families relocate strategically. Life reorganizes around the rhythm of conflict. Not panicked, measured. War becomes an environmental factor. Like climate, you cannot remove it. You prepare for it. Preparation breeds resilience. Resilience breeds endurance. Endurance breeds normalization. And normalization changes mentality. People no longer ask whether conflict will come. They ask, when? Back in Europe, legal language evolves subtly. Charters mention crusading obligations, almost casually. It appears alongside inheritance clauses, as if it were routine, which it has become. A nobleman drafts his will. before departing, not dramatically, practically, temporary absence anticipated, permanent documentation required. Clerks grow accustomed to it. Shipbuilders plan capacity cycles. Moneylenders adjust interest expectations. Even monasteries schedule prayers for departing contingents. Everything aligns around repetition. It is no longer extraordinary. It is part of the calendar of possibility. Yet fatigue seeps in. Enthusiasm cools. Not entirely, but enough. The rhetoric remains intense. The sermons passionate. But the people listening have heard versions before. They weigh cost more carefully. Temporary zeal, permanent realism. The machinery still functions, but with more hesitation, which is natural. Because systems mature, they become heavier, more expensive, less impulsive, and sometimes that hesitation changes outcomes. A campaign delayed, a force smaller than expected, a negotiation chosen instead of assault. The infrastructure exists, but the human appetite shifts. Not from indifference, from accumulation. Too many absences, too many debts, too many stories of siege and ransom. Memory tempers impulse. Temporary fervor meets permanent experience. In the East, children born after decades of crusading know no other rhythm. They speak multiple languages, navigate layered identities, are loyal to lords whose authority was once improvised. For them, the Crusader states are not temporary occupations. They are home, home built from repetition, home built from adaptation, home built from systems that hardened because they had to. And when those systems eventually collapse, in certain places, the collapse feels like exile, not correction, because permanence is relative. Stay long enough, and even improvisation feels eternal. It is almost ironic. The Crusades began as urgent responses, quick mobilizations, time-sensitive missions, and yet they stretched across centuries, because once you build a framework, it seeks purpose. Once you normalize departure, someone will depart. Once you create legal privilege, someone will invoke it. Once you build fleets, someone will sail. The initial spark matters less than the structure built around it. And the structure, slowly, quietly, reshapes worldview. The world becomes mapped differently. East and West, not as distant abstractions, but as connected corridors. Threat and opportunity intertwined. Identity sharpened. Identity questioned. Temporary mobilization. Permanent mental geography. That boy, near the hearth, grows older. He hears another call. He does not tremble. He calculates. He knows the process, the protections, the costs, the risks. He has inherited not only faith, but framework. And that framework, built from cloth, from wells, from debt, from siege towers, from ransoms, from port quarters, from courtrooms, now feels natural, as if it has always been there. But it has not. It was assembled, piece by piece, under pressure, repeated until solid. And that is perhaps the quietest transformation of all. Not the fall of cities, not the clash of armies, but the slow acceptance that long war can feel ordinary. Temporary campaign, permanent mindset. There comes a time when the shouting softens, not entirely, but noticeably. Fewer banners raised, fewer dramatic departures. The speeches continue, but they feel rehearsed. The crowd listens politely. Some even nod, but calculation hums beneath devotion. Temporary enthusiasm has cooled into experience. And yet, the machinery does not vanish. Ships are still capable of being built. Clerks still understand how to suspend debts. Courts still recognize crusading privilege. Military orders still own land. The infrastructure remains, like a hearth that no longer roars, but still holds embers. It would take very little to ignite it again, and occasionally it is. A new crisis in the East, a new appeal from a ruler, a new sermon delivered with urgency. The response is smaller, more cautious, but the system activates. Not from chaos, from familiarity, temporary revival, permanent readiness. In port cities, the quarters remain. The baker's grandson still bakes. He does not think of himself as part of a crusading legacy. He thinks of himself as a baker. Yet the oven exists because of a movement that once claimed to be urgent and brief. Trade routes remain intact. Coins continue to flow. Languages still intermingle. Even when armies shrink, commerce rarely retreats fully, because profit does not depend on fervor. It depends on habit, and habit is resilient. Temporary war, permanent corridor. In Europe, the legal language lingers. Clauses drafted generations ago are still referenced, not always for crusades, but for other campaigns, other causes. The template is versatile. It can be applied elsewhere. The idea of sanctified conflict is now administratively viable, and viability ensures reuse. Even when the original enthusiasm fades, temporary decline, permanent conceptual tool, there is also fatigue, deep fatigue, families less eager to part with sons, lenders less generous with suspension, rulers more aware of cost. The ledger has grown heavy. Too many absences, too many ransoms, too many sieges that ended in stalemate. Temporary glory, permanent debt, and debt whispers caution. It reshapes ambition. It narrows appetite. The later Crusades feel different, smaller, more negotiated, more diplomatic, because systems mature. They learn from failure, and failure accumulates. Yet, in monasteries, prayers for the Holy Land persist, not with the urgency of the first generation, but with steady repetition, memory institutionalized. Temporary outrage has become liturgical rhythm, which is perhaps more enduring, because liturgy does not require excitement. It requires consistency, and consistency outlives passion. In the East, the last strongholds fall one by one. Ports lost, castles abandoned. The sense of frontier recedes. But the practices do not evaporate. Military orders relocate, regroup, rebrand. Their discipline intact, their estates secure. Temporary relocation, permanent continuity. Even in loss, structure survives. The cross, stitched to cloth, may no longer lead armies eastward, but it has shaped identities, shaped law, shaped architecture, shaped trade, shaped expectations, and those shapes do not flatten easily. There is something quietly human about how movements end, not with a final, clean conclusion, but with gradual thinning, like a tide pulling back, leaving patterns in sand. The patterns remain long after the water withdraws. Generations later, people argue about the Crusades, interpret them, judge them, romanticize them, condemn them, but they are discussing something that built frameworks, frameworks that altered how Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean imagined each other, imagined distance, imagined duty, imagined conflict, temporary mobilization, left permanent imagination, and imagination guides policy, long after swords rust. If you step back now, you can almost trace it. A piece of cloth, a suspended debt, a well with assigned guards, a siege tower, a ransom tent, a port warehouse, a courtroom ruling, a sermon, a refugee ship, a child born in a camp, each small, each practical, each meant to solve a moment, and each repeated. Repetition is the true architect. It builds more quietly than conquest. It lasts longer than victory. The Crusades, in the end, were not only battles, they were habits. Habits reinforced under pressure. Habits that hardened into systems. Systems that shaped centuries. And even when the banners fade, the habits remain in trade, in law, in memory, in the quiet assumption that structures built in urgency might last longer than anyone intended. There is an old chest in a quiet house, not in Jerusalem, not in Acre, in a village far from the sea. Inside the chest, linen, a few letters, a small, faded piece of cloth, read once, now dulled by time. No one remembers exactly when it was stitched, only that it was. It belonged to someone who once believed this was temporary, a season, a campaign, a vow. He may have returned, he may not have, but the cloth remained. Symbols are stubborn, they outlast logistics, outlast ports and charters and siege towers, outlast even the institutions that grew around them. The cross, stitched for one expedition, became emblem, then memory, then identity, temporary sign, permanent echo. By now, the machinery is quieter. No fleets assembling in frantic haste, no large crowds surging with fresh urgency, but the habits remain: documentation before departure, calculation before zeal, architecture informed by distant sieges, trade routes shaped by former corridors, even suspicion and admiration, interwoven in subtle ways. The Crusades do not need to be active to remain influential. They have already done their shaping, already bent mental maps, already layered law with precedent, already taught generations how to mobilize belief, temporary campaigns, permanent reflexes. Imagine a grandson finding that faded cloth. He does not plan to leave. He may never travel beyond his region, but he knows the story. He knows that once men left for distant shores with protection from debt and promise of absolution. He knows that ports grew busy, that cities fell, that ransoms were paid. He inherits not experience, but narrative. Narrative becomes inheritance. Inheritance becomes identity. Even if the journey itself never repeats, the possibility once existed. That is enough to reshape imagination. Meanwhile, across the Mediterranean, communities once labeled frontier have long since adjusted. New rulers, new patterns, but the memory of those decades remains. In architecture altered for defense, in chronicles written with layered perspective, in medical traditions that borrowed quietly, in cuisine blended, in words adopted from one language into another. Temporary collision, permanent layering. Layering is subtle. It does not demand attention. It simply accumulates until one day it feels natural. There is a strange comfort in imagining that movements end cleanly, that there is a final moment when the machinery stops, But most systems do not collapse dramatically. They thin, they shift, they repurpose. Military orders change mission. Legal privileges adapt to new contexts. Trade networks outlive ideology. Temporary fervor cools. Permanent infrastructure remains. Like stone foundations beneath a renovated house. You may repaint the walls, replace the furniture, but the base was laid long ago, under pressure, under urgency, under the belief that it was only for now. If you follow the thread backward, from faded cloth to quiet hearth, to courtroom parchment, to port warehouse, to ransom tent, to siege tower, to guarded well, you see the pattern, not a single straight line, but loops, repetitions, adjustments layered upon adjustments. Every crisis answered with improvisation, every improvisation repeated, every repetition hardened, until temporary became structural, and structural became assumed. The Crusades were once described as journeys to reclaim, but in reclaiming, they reorganized. They reorganized law, commerce, memory, mental geography, even the concept of what a campaign could be, not merely a battle, but a mobilized system, a portable framework, activated and paused across generations. And frameworks do not dissolve easily. They embed, they persist, they wait. Somewhere tonight, in a quiet village, that old chest remains closed, the cloth inside no longer bright, but intact. And perhaps that is the final irony. The symbol endured, the urgency faded, the systems evolved, but the small, simple gesture, a stitch of fabric onto a shoulder, outlasted fleets, outlasted fortresses, outlasted even the idea that it was ever meant to be temporary. There is a quiet morning, no banners, no preacher, just routine. A father adjusts his son's collar, not because he is leaving for Jerusalem, because he is leaving for something else. Another campaign, another border, another cause framed as urgent. The language is different now. The structure is familiar. Preparation before departure. Documents signed, property secured, family instructed, temporary mobilization, permanent reflex. No one calls it a crusade in this moment, and yet the pattern breathes underneath. The idea that conflict can be organized, that absence can be legalized, that belief can be administratively mobilized. These are not spontaneous instincts. They were learned, layered, repeated until natural. Somewhere in a coastal city, ships are still built efficiently, not for pilgrimage, for trade, for war, for empire. The logistics refined centuries earlier still echo in dockyards. Timber measured precisely, contracts carefully worded, investments calculated with caution. Temporary expedition taught permanent shipbuilding discipline. No one says it aloud, but the inheritance is there. In a courtroom, a judge references precedent, not crusading law, but law that evolved during that era. Written clarity preferred over vague promise, because vague promise once cost too much. Temporary ambiguity, permanent preference for documentation. It feels obvious now. It did not once. In kitchens across Europe, spices once foreign have become ordinary. Names adapted, recipes inherited. Temporary novelty, permanent taste. No one at the table thinks of siege lines while seasoning food, but corridors carved by war once carried those flavors. And corridors, once established, rarely vanish completely. Memory is selective. Some remember glory. Some remember tragedy. Some remember cost. But beneath memory lies habit. And habit is harder to erase than opinion. The Crusades were debated, praised, condemned, romanticized. But the systems they built did not wait for consensus. They simply functioned. They continued shaping behavior quietly, persistently. There is something unsettling about how temporary urgency can produce permanent architecture, how a vow stitched in haste can alter economies, how a sermon delivered in passion can refine bureaucracy, how a siege endured in desperation can improve engineering. Human beings are adaptive. They refine under pressure, and refinement does not disappear. When pressure lifts, it remains available, ready to be used again in new forms for new purposes. If you imagine time as a river, the Crusades were not a single wave. They were a current, sometimes rapid, sometimes slow, but carving, shaping the banks, redirecting flow, and when the visible turbulence settles, the altered riverbed remains. That is permanence, not dramatic, but structural. Perhaps that is the quiet truth. Movements fade, symbols soften, but habits endure. The habit of organizing belief, the habit of legalizing absence, the habit of turning urgency into system, the habit of repeating what once worked, even if it began as improvisation, temporary fire, permanent imprint, and somewhere, even now, in a world far removed from medieval fields, someone signs a document before leaving home. Someone calculates risk and protection. Someone invokes a framework built long ago. They do not see the thread, but it is there, woven through centuries, through cloth, through debt, through water, through law, through silence. And if you close your eyes for a moment, you can almost hear it, not the clash of swords, but the quiet scratch of a quill, writing something meant to solve today's problem, unaware that it might last far longer than intended.